Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the second week on the course on stress management. This week we shall study about stress psychophysiology, that is how the stress is modulated in the human body, how the brain responds during a stressful situation, and how does stress affect the immune system, the organs, different organs of the body, and what are the disorders that are caused by stress. In the first module today we shall discuss about the stress and the nervous system, and we will give you a brief outline on the nervous system and what are the structures that are involved in the stress physiology. To begin with, we shall again go back to Hans Selye and his general adaptation syndrome. Hans Selye developed the idea that a direct relationship exists between chronic stress and excessive wear and tear throughout the body. He spoke about, when he spoke about facing resistance and the period stage of exhaustion, he was talking about the excessive wear and tear that the body goes through during stress. Now, in today's lesson, we shall discuss how this happens and how the brain functions during this wear and tear of the body. So, to begin with, when we are talking about the brain and stress, we must understand that the brain reacts to stress in a series of neural and chemical reactions that are meant for physical survival. Now, this brings us to a very interesting notion that we had studied in week 1, where we mentioned that the brain is used to react for physical survival, but unfortunately over the years, even now when physical survival is not at stake in all social situations, the brain still responds in the same way. That shall bring us to the effects of stress and how it causes illness, which we will study in the next module. But again, to come back to it, stress may be caused by biological agents like viruses and bacteria, environment, that can be temperature, weather conditions, and psychological agents where it is like a threat to self-esteem, loss of a loved one resulting in loneliness, social isolation, being publicly ridiculed, etc. These stresses are actually perceived by the body and then interpreted by the brain. So, the stressor may be from outside and or may be from within, that is, it may be a biological stressor, it may be an environmental stressor we have spoken of earlier, and these are perceived by the various sense organs and then they are interpreted by the brain. The brain then instructs the rest of the body as to how to respond to it and also adjust to it, that is, whether this is a stressor that the body can cope with, or that is to adapt to it and adjust to it, and many times also whether to give a fight or flight or in fact a freeze response as well. So, this brings us to Lazarus's cognitive appraisal theory, which I have spoken about earlier and will speak of again later, where it is not the stressor by itself that is actually the cause of stress within an individual. It is the perception of the stressor, how the individual, or in this case how the brain sees the stressor, and then how does it respond, instruct the body to respond to it. Now, why is it important to understand the physiology of stress? If one understands the physiology of stress, then one can begin to use this knowledge to augment one's own health and well-being through different stress management techniques. Like, for example, we will discuss the relaxation techniques, the autogenic training, and several other methods. And if you are aware that how this is actually working within your body, you will also be able to understand the changes that your body is going through, and that will help you to develop a sense of control over yourself. We have spoken about sense of control and how it actually affects the stress response. So, once we feel that we have a control over our system, then it helps us to deal with the stressor more effectively. So, it is important to know what happens to our body during a stressful situation. For example, say giving a presentation in front of experts where you shall be evaluated. So, we know that in such a situation there are physiological changes that a body may go through, like pounding of the heart, muscles tensing up, sweating, dryness of the mouth, etc. And there may be the psychological changes or the psychological responses of being fearful and being very anxious. So, why is the body going through these changes? Now, that brings us to the different physiological systems that are involved in the stress response. So, primarily the three systems, that is the nervous system, the endocrine system and the immune system, are involved in the modulating of stress within the individual. Optimally, when these three systems are working ideally, their interaction helps to maintain homeostasis and wellness. But when there is a problem with any of these systems, then it causes an eruption of overstressful responses, and it may also affect the different systems of the body. Like one may develop some endocrinal problems like dysregulation of the thyroid hormone, or one may develop several immunological problems due to stress. Now, coming to the brain and its several structures. The brain consists of primarily the three parts: the forebrain, the midbrain and the hindbrain. So, the forebrain is the higher part of the brain, or which is actually involved in the higher order functioning, and it consists of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex and also the diencephalon, that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The midbrain is a very important part which is related to the sensory impulses, and the hindbrain consists of the cerebellum, the pons, medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. Now, for our convenience, we shall discuss the brain today in a different way. So, primarily we will divide the human brain into three levels, that is the vegetative level, the limbic system and the neocortical level. The reason for doing this is we will understand how these responses, how these structures actually are involved in the stressful situation. As you can see, the vegetative level is primarily related to the autonomic arousal. So, that is the breathing, heart rate. So, these are more of the physiological responses. The limbic system is related to the emotional thought processing, and the cortical level is for the higher order functions. That is what we were talking about, the forebrain structures, okay, and primarily the cerebral cortex. So, this is related to rational thought processing. So, coming to the vegetative level, the lowest level of the brain the vegetative level consists of the two structures, the reticular formation and the brain stem. Now, both these structures, as we have seen, are related to the regulation of the responses. So, like heart rate, breathing, sleep, etc. So, again going back, see, the reticular activating system takes its impulses from the optic fibers, the auditory fibers, so from the various cranial nerves, and this actually screens the stimulus, and with the help of the relay center or the thalamus sends the impulses to the various parts of the brain. Now, why is the reticular activating system so important in stress physiology? We have already discussed about the reticular activating system being a network of 9 nerves that connects the mind and the body, and when functioning normally, it provides the neural connections that are needed for the processing and learning of information and the ability to pay attention to the correct task. So, that is when the filtering is done properly. So, if the reticular activating system does not excite the neurons of the cortex much as it ought to, then an under aroused cortex results in effects like difficulty in learning, poor memory and very less self control. On the other hand, if RAS is too excited and arouses the cortex too much, then stressful responses are resulted. That is, an individual may be easily startled, may become hypervigilant, may be restless and also be very hyperactive. Now, as you understand, the arousal, the over arousal of the reticular activating system thus is very much related to the vigilance response or the arousal, over arousal responses that happen during a stressful situation. Now, again going back to the brain structures, so we will discuss the brain stem. So, as you can see, the brain stem consists of the pons, the medulla oblongata and the mesencephalon. Now, the brain stem is responsible for involuntary functions of the body. So, they are like the heartbeat, the respiration and the vasomotor activity. So, getting to more specific details, the medulla oblongata regulates the heartbeat, respiration and other such basic physiological processes. The pons regulates the sleep cycle. The mesencephalon is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep wake arousal system, that is alertness and temperature regulation. So, primarily as you see, the vegetative level is responsible for the various physiological processes that are required to stay alive. So, we have spoken about the reticular activating system and the medulla oblongata, pons and mesencephalon, which are responsible for the physiological processes. Now, coming to the limbic system. We all know that the limbic system is related to the emotional response, and then why is it so important in understanding stress? So, we know that when an individual faces a stressful situation, there are several times many emotional responses that occur. On the other hand, an emotional situation, an emotional stressor or a stressor that is perceived as an anxiety provoking stressor or a fear provoking stressor will also induce a stressful response. Thus, the limbic system is very closely associated with stress. The limbic system consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus and the pituitary gland. So, basically the major areas, the thalamus is actually not a structure of the limbic system, but it is related to relaying the responses of the limbic system to other areas of the brain. The hypothalamus is a very small structure that is just below the thalamus. So, hypo stands for under, and just under the thalamus there is a very small structure which actually is one of the major regulators of homeostasis in the body. It is also a regulator for releasing several hormones within the body. We will study the role of hypothalamus in stress in detail in the next section, but as for now we will see that hypothalamus maintains homeostasis and regulates discharge of hormones during stress. The amygdala, which is an two almond shaped structures on either side of the thalamus and then the lower end of the hippocampus, deals with emotions, and we actually see that if there is a lesion in the amygdala, there is a very strange tame response that is seen within the individual. So, the amygdala is related to emotions like stress, anger, and also aggression. The hippocampus, another structure, a very important structure of the limbic system, is situated at the curved back of the amygdala, and it is like two horns, and this is related to the long term memory or the storage of memory. So, if there is a damage in the hippocampus, then it affects new memories being formed. Now, the hippocampus and the amygdala, these are very important limbic structures that are related to the past, how we store memory, how we store emotional responses within the brain, and that also is very important as to understanding to perceiving a situation, perceiving a stressful situation. For example, if I see a dog running towards me, my knowledge or the information that this dog may actually be harmful, and it may be a threatening creature, it may bite me, this information will come from the limbic structures, and that is why it will actually trigger the fight or flight response. Along with that, the pituitary gland is also a part of the limbic system. The pituitary gland is known as the master gland, and it releases stress hormones. We will study it in detail in the next section, but as for now, just to mention the different limbic structures, I have brought in the pituitary gland. We must remember that the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland work in unison to maintain a level of homeostasis within the body. So, here is the limbic system. So, this is the horn like structure or the hippocampus, this is the amygdala, and this is the relay center or the thalamus. Now, the limbic system, as we can see, produces emotions like fear, anxiety, and joy in response to several physical and psychological signals. Now, coming to the highest level of the brain, that is the cortical level. The cortical level, or in this case the neocortex, actually is responsible for the higher order functioning. So, it is like involved in the higher order functions of sensory perception, generation of the motor commands, conscious thought, and language. Also, it is related to decision making and problem solving. It is at this level that sensory information is processed as a threat or a non-threat, and where cognition takes place. So, this brings us back to the Lazarus's theory of cognitive appraisal again. So, just by seeing a tiger coming towards me, or just by seeing two lights on a railway track from far away, does not mean that an individual will be threatened by it or feel stress because of seeing the two lights or by seeing a tiger. It is the appraisal of the image that we see that actually causes stress. So, the information that is received by the lower level structures and which is mediated through the reticular activating system passes through the limbic system, and then when it goes to the even if it is perceived as a fearful stimulus, when it comes to the forebrain, in this case the neocortex, then the decision is made whether this is so threatening to offer the fight or flight response. In fact, what response will it be? Whether it will be a fight response, a flight response, or many times a freeze response, as in pretending to be dead, which is actually done by several animals, and even by a raped victim during the traumatic event. This selection of the response is done in this neocortical level. The most interesting part is that this higher level of the brain can actually override a lower level and can influence emotional responses. As I mentioned, that even if the diencephalon, that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, recognizes fear, the neocortex can use its judgment to recognize the stimulus as non-threatening and override the fear. So, if I see two lights coming towards my way when I am standing near the railway track, the appraisal of the situation that, well, this is a train which will travel only on the track and I am outside the track, will stop the fear response that spontaneously spurt out by seeing the signaling lights. Now, coming back again to the diencephalon, we just spoke about the diencephalon here as the organs which recognize fear, and we said that the thalamus and the hypothalamus are a part of the diencephalon. Now, I have talked about the thalamus and the hypothalamus before, but just to revise it once again, the thalamus relays the sensory impulses from other parts of the nervous system to the cerebral cortex, and the hypothalamus is a key structure in stress reactivity and is the primary activator of the autonomic nervous system. Now, coming back to the brain again, we have covered almost all these organs that are involved with stress, and now to the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system regulates the visceral activities and the vital organs, that is circulation, digestion, respiration and temperature regulation. The autonomic nervous system consists of two parts, the sympathetic activation system and the parasympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic activation system. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the responses associated with the fight or flight response. So, this physical arousal of the fight or flight response is actually stimulated through the release of the two hormones, primarily the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. These are also known as the adrenaline and the noradrenaline, as they are secreted from the adrenaline gland. And the parasympathetic nervous system maintains the homeostasis of the body by the release of the hormone acetylcholine or ACH, and is responsible for energy conservation and relaxation of the body. So, the body cannot remain in an active sympathetic state for a long time. So, initially during a stress response, when the body responds to a fight or flight situation, after a certain period of time, the body is brought back to the sympathetic system switches off when the stressor is not there, and then the parasympathetic system takes charge. Now, this is very important for the conservation of the body. If the heart, as in the sympathetic activation, if the heart keeps pumping the blood at a higher rate for a longer time, then the body cannot be able to sustain for long. So, the parasympathetic nervous system has to take charge after the threat response is removed. Several times how this is done we will study when we discuss the HPA axis. So, what happens when we encounter a stressor? When we encounter a stressor, the body part, that is the several sense organs, it could be the eyes, nose or ears, or in fact even the muscles, first notes the stressor and passes the message along the nerves, that is the cranial nerves, to the brain. So, these messages then pass through the reticular activating system. We have seen how it is filtered by the reticular activating system either from or to the limbic system and the thalamus. The emotion then evolves in the limbic system, that is whether this is a fearful situation, this is a joyful situation, or this is a sad situation, unpleasant sad situation, is decided by the limbic system. So, we remember the limbic structures that are related to it, primarily the amygdala, the hippocampus, these are, and the basal ganglia, which we haven't discussed in this case. And then it travels to the thalamus, which serves as the switchboard. That is, it determines what to do with the incoming messages, where to send the impulse to which organ. Now, when this is a stress message, so the hypothalamus, it triggers the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus comes into play to activate the two major stress reactivity pathways, that is the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. So, the endocrine system we shall study later, so in the next session. And so, finally, we come to the end of this session. Very briefly, we have discussed about the various brain structures that are involved in stress and how we have given you an overview of how it relates to, these structures relate to stress physiology and creates stress within the organism, and how the body responds to stress. In the next session, we shall discuss the endocrine system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Thank you.